Before we begin, please turn off your cell phones as we are going live on YouTube. Okay, well, buddy, can you spare a Bitcoin? Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our program, Blockchain 101, Cryptocurrencies, Smart Contracts, and Beyond. All you need to know, an interactive talk and presentation with MI member, Professor John Villasenor. So before we begin, I'd like to find out how many of you are new to the Mechanics Institute. Who's never been here before? Any newcomers? One. Okay, well, join us on Wednesday at noon. You can come and take the free tour, see our beautiful library, which is on second and third floors, and see the International Chess Club, and also find out about our wonderful events and programs, author events, panel discussions, Cinema Lit film series on Friday, the book clubs, writers groups presented by the library, and of course classes and tournaments presented by the chess club. So there's so much under one roof, and we hope you'll take the tour and also become a member of our wonderful cultural institution here at 57 Post Street. Also, you can pick up our membership brochure and also information about upcoming events either here or on our website. And now I'd like to introduce John Villasenor. He is on the faculty of UCLA, where he's a professor of electrical engineering, public policy and management, and a visiting professor of law. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a national fellow at the Hoover Institution. And this presentation and talk tonight was also presented on Capitol Hill. So please welcome John Villasenor and enjoy our program and ask questions along the way. Thanks.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I know that all of you have plenty of things that you can be doing, and so I'll try to make this session as useful and worthwhile as possible. The title, the all you need to know part, I'm not sure we're going to get to that. I just finished teaching an 8-hour, not one sitting, but a course that had 8 hours on this topic. And earlier this year, I taught a seminar at UCLA that spanned a few months. So the goal is certainly not to cover everything that could possibly be covered, but to provide at least an overview of this technology and its applications and its challenges. And I should also say that I'm more than happy to take questions along the way. If I say something that any of you have any questions about, please feel free to raise your hand and I'll try to get to it. And I'm also, the other thing I'll say is I'm sensitive to the fact that this is a scheduled event. It's supposed to end at 7:30 and it will. So you won't be sitting there thinking, gosh, when is he going to stop? Because it's 7:50 or something. So okay, just as a very high level initial pictorial view of some of the things that we're talking about, we can think very generally of two different kinds of networks. And when I'm talking about networks here, I'm talking about networks of computers, where each one of these little dots here is a computer or a cluster of computers. And in a centralized network, then you, as you can see here, you have one computer or system which sits at the center of the network. And of course, any message that traverses the network would necessarily pass through this point at the center. And so it's called a centralized network. In a distributed network, you might have a similar number of nodes in the network, but as is clear from the picture here, messages traverse the network through any number of paths. And as is also clear, unlike in the centralized network on the left and the distributed network on the right, there's no single node that has visibility or control over the network, right? This node here could shut down the network if it just stopped passing messages that were arriving to it to be sent to other places, but there's no single node here that has that position of power. And so the blockchain networks that we're going to be talking about look conceptually like this. They lack a particular central point of control. That's a very high-level distribution. One a more formal phrase that's sometimes used to talk about this technology is DLT, the acronym Distributed Ledger Technology. And I'll explain sort of all those terms in a moment. But basically, it uses a network of computers, which we can call nodes. And one of the most interesting things about this technology is that the individual nodes, the individual computers that comprise the network, aren't necessarily trustworthy. But despite that fact, in the aggregate, the network behaves in a trusted manner. And that's a really interesting quasi-paradoxical result, right? The fact that you can build a trusted system composed of components that individually, taken one at a time, aren't necessarily trusted. There's no centralized entity that controls the network. A few other attributes that you find here: it's cryptographically secure, and what that means is that cryptographic methods are used to basically ensure or attempt to ensure that the messages transmitted across the network have integrity, in the sense that they were indeed sent by the parties that purport to have sent them. These systems are open and transparent up to a point, and we're going to see the point beyond which they're not transparent, but many aspects of them are open and transparent. And up to a certain point, they're unchangeable, meaning that once a transaction or an event has been logged in the system, it becomes increasingly difficult as time goes on, in general, to go back and alter something that occurred in the past. So this is a very high-level overview of some of the attributes of these blockchain-based systems. The other thing I should get to very quickly in a talk with this title is, why is it called a blockchain? It's probably the most single fundamental question that somebody might ask. And the answer is that we have a block, we'll call it block number 1, and in this block we're going to record a series of transactions, and the type of transactions that we're going to record would depend on what the blockchain is related to. If it's a cryptocurrency, then the transactions could be people sending other people cryptocurrencies. If it's some other kind of blockchain, there might be different types of transactions. But regardless of the specific nature of these events or the transactions, we're going to record them. And after, yes, you had a question?
First of all, from the previous slide, just a one-sentence definition of cryptographic, when you say cryptographically secure, and then I'm still not getting what a block is.
Yeah, I'll explain that. So cryptographic just simply means that you use cryptography or cryptographic-based methods to, for example, if I'm sending you $10 and I send a message to the network saying I'm going to do that, cryptography can be used, or cryptographic methods can be used to give you confidence that it really is me that's sending the $10, and make it difficult for somebody who's not me to send my $10. So cryptography gives us a measure of security. And I'll illustrate this all in more detail in just a moment, but we have a bunch of, in a network where a bunch of things are happening, a bunch of events are occurring, each one of these events can be considered a sort of a transaction. And again, I'll illustrate with concrete examples in a moment. But we're going to accumulate all these transactions. Let's suppose all of us are handing each other coins. You know, I hand this person a quarter, and she hands him a dime, and we're all handing each other coins. Each one of those transactions could be noted in a block. And after 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 20 minutes or whatever the time is, we're going to stop putting we're going to close that block, and we're basically going to say, from now on, the transactions are going to go into this next block. And this second block will also have a reference back to this first block. So you couldn't simply just switch these around, because then the kind of coherence in the chain would be lost. So you've got a whole list of transactions all represented in blocks, and each block has sort of a pointer or a connection to the previous block. And so you have a chain of blocks, each one of which contains a bunch of transactions. And again, I'll explain why it's called what's in a block in a bit. But one of the most important thing is it's a public register of transactions. So I used the phrase distributed ledger before, and we're all familiar with ledgers, like in accounting, the idea that you can have a ledger book to note things that happen. But blockchain technologies give us a public ledger that is a ledger that, at least up to a certain point, anybody in the world is free to look at the transactions that occur inside that ledger. And again, I'm going to give examples to sort of make this more concrete. So anyway, we construct a string of blocks that contain all these transactions. I also want to mention that it's a slightly more technical term, but I'll give it an example. Blockchains are very widely used for what we call state transitions, when something changes. So we have a state at one particular time, and a transaction occurs, and after that transaction, due to that transaction, there's a new state at the next time instant. So I'll give you a particular example here. Let's suppose that at some point in time, I have $40 and Carmen has $15. And the transaction is, I'm going to send $30 to Carmen. And of course, after that transaction occurs, then I will, instead of having $40, I'll have $10. And Carmen, instead of having $15, will have $45, right? So this is the initial state, and this is the new state, and the transaction is the thing that brought us from one state to another. Okay, so it's a very simple concept, but the blockchain is a way to record transactions like this and far more complex transactions in this public distributed ledger. That's just an example of a type of information that you can record in a blockchain. And again, that might not seem that exciting, but you can get much more sophisticated versions as well. The other thing I wanted to show is a taxonomy of applications, because people sometimes talk, the title of this talk includes Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is one example of many, many different cryptocurrencies. A cryptocurrency is a digital distributed currency, of which Bitcoin is an example, but there's many other ones as well. Bitcoin just happens to be the one that's gotten the most press and is the most widely used. Now, cryptocurrencies, in turn, are a subset. They're an example of the applications of this technology. There's plenty of applications. In fact, in my opinion, the most interesting applications are not cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies have generated a lot of the press, but to me, the most interesting applications of this technology actually lie outside of cryptocurrencies, and I'll be talking about what some of those are as well. But I thought this taxonomy is perhaps helpful to sort of know, kind of put these different concepts in their relative kind of order within the list of applications. So here's a list of application examples that this technology can be used for. One is cryptocurrencies, and I'm going to go through, I'll give you a fairly specific example of Bitcoin and how that works. Another is smart contracts, which I'll be talking about as well. Smart contracts are really, really an interesting idea. They're these ideas of contracts, like the contracts that you might encounter in your life generally, but they're expressed in computer code and they're deployed in these distributed networks, and that offers some really interesting potentials to do some interesting things. Registers of assets, digital or otherwise, so who owns what. It could be something as simple as who owns a particular digital work of like a song, digital song, to something as large as who owns a piece of real estate. Digital rights management, one of the really interesting applications for this technology is to automate royalty payments for artists, for example, when their song is streamed on the internet. Supply chain management. I'll give you an example. When I give supply chain management, people say, well, what's an example? So here's an example. When you go to the pharmacy and you buy a medication today, you might see that the medication says, make sure not to store below 85 degrees or something like that, right? But when you buy this medication, you really have no way of knowing whether 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago this medication was or wasn't in a truck in a parking lot in Arizona, and the driver accidentally turned the air conditioning on. You just don't know, right? So with the blockchain, one of the things you could do is have medications like that have those sort of requirements have the temperature measured every 5 minutes. And that information stored in a blockchain, and then when you go to the pharmacy and you're going to buy it, you'd take your smartphone, you'd scan something, and it'd go beep, and it would say, aha, this thing has never, since it was manufactured, been over 82 degrees or something like that. So that's a concrete example of a supply chain weakness that we all sort of take for granted today, but that could be greatly helped by using this kind of technology. A time stamping for events or documents, so to prove that a certain person had indeed submitted or done something by a certain day or time. So those are examples of applications. This I'm not going to read all the words here, but I wanted to show you, this is a patent application publication. And the only reason I wanted to show it, it was just published pretty recently, March of this year, is that the applicant, the entity applying for the patent is the United States Postal Service, and this is a blockchain-based application. And I mention this just because there's a lot of buzz on this technology, and people tend to think of the stereotypical entity that might be working on this would be some very nimble startup company filled with, these 20-something computer types in Silicon Valley. But this just shows that some of the most sort of staid organizations we have in the country, the United States Postal Service of all things, is also looking very seriously at this. Yes, sir.
Professor, it's pretty clear how we put the data gets in to the blocks. Okay, that's a term. Where's the ledger? How do I find out whether so-and-so did a transaction umpteen blocks ago? How do you get...
Yeah, that's a great, so the question is, how do you know what's in what's the contents of the ledger? The answer is the ledger is visible instantly to everybody. Okay, so if you look at the Bitcoin system, right now, any of you could go on and look in 1 minute, find any Bitcoin transaction you were looking for that had ever occurred since the network was launched in 2009 or so. So these transactions, because it's a public ledger, they're public from the get-go, and they're always public. There's nobody that holds the key. In fact, there's thousands of places you could go to look because there's thousands of copies of this ledger. And the fact that this information is replicated many, many times itself gives you a lot of robustness, right? I'll give you another example. If an unethical student wanted to change his grade from a C to an A, in a typical school, that information would be held in one place, and if the unethical student was a very skilled hacker, he or she might be able to get in there. But imagine if the student grades were held in 1,000 different places, right? Well, then the unethical, skilled hacker student couldn't possibly hack into 1,000 different computers to change the grade. Maybe he could hack into one of them, but not into 1,000. So the answer is these transactions are immediately visible the moment they occur. And we're going to go look at some in just a minute. We're going to see these transactions.
Everybody in here has used freaking search. It used to be pretty good a decade ago, but now you can't find diddly. How are we going to find anything in these blocks?
Well, it's very easy because you could easily search the entire Bitcoin transaction database if you wanted to look for a particular transaction. It would take you just seconds.
And you can key on what?
Well, I mean, for example, if you wanted to see, show me all the times that anybody has ever sent, the equivalent of $100.123 in Bitcoin. You could do a search for that amount of Bitcoin, and all the transactions that had ever taken, they'd pop up, and you could look at them. So.
Yeah, but an amount is a independent variable. The dependent variable is your name, my address.
Oh, you wouldn't know if I'd sent to anyone Bitcoin. That you might never know that. I'll explain that in a bit. That's anonymous, or not quite anonymous, but synonymous. So I want to identify some challenges because I think there's been a lot of perhaps over-promising with respect to this technology. So I have a list of 6 or 7 things that are challenges that I think really should be front and center in any discussion on this topic. So one is the integrity of a blockchain. The integrity is the idea that it can be trusted, and the whole point is that you're creating this trusted distributed system. But that only works if the entity maintains its trust, right? If it stays trusted. If it's trustworthy today and it's not trustworthy tomorrow, it's not a particularly useful system. So there's a concept called a 50% or 51% attack in Bitcoin and many of these blockchain-based systems, where if any single entity is able to get control of more than 50% of the processing power, then that entity could compromise the trust of the network. So if you were thinking in some environment of adopting a blockchain-based technique, you'd have to be confident that you'd be able to avoid this problem. So this is a vulnerability of these systems. Another challenge is security. And now, to be fair, security is a challenge in any digital environment, but it's a challenge here. This is an article from February 2014 where there was a company in this space, which at that time was the largest Bitcoin exchange in the world. And long story short, there was problems with the security, and something like $500 million worth of Bitcoin went missing. So that was obviously an important event if you were the owner of one of those Bitcoins. Another big challenge in this space is scalability, and by that I mean that something that works well when you have a small number of users may not work as well when the number of users gets enormous. And it's very hard in any environment. It's very hard to design a system that scales well, that smoothly works even as the number of users grows by a factor of 10 or 100 or 1,000 or more. And in the blockchain environment, we have the same challenges as well. Energy consumption is a huge issue. This is a November 2017 article where the headline was Bitcoin mining now consuming more electricity than 159 countries, including Ireland and most countries in Africa. So it's a huge problem, right? The Bitcoin mining is the process by which these transactions in the Bitcoin network are sort of validated. And the way it works is people have computers that are basically playing the lottery. They're guessing random numbers very, very quickly. And there's a lot of computers around guessing a lot of numbers. But the aggregate energy being consumed by those computers in November of last year was more than the energy being consumed by Ireland, right? So that's really an unacceptable trade-off. It's a bad. It's certainly not. It's the very opposite of energy efficient. So that's a challenge as well. Another, I couldn't think of a nice sort of clean way to say this, so this is an inelegant way, but I wrote handling changes mandated from outside the blockchain. You know, for example, a court-ordered change to information in a property registry. So I'll give you an example. So there's some people who suggest that for recording real estate ownership, we should use the blockchain. Okay, well, maybe. But I suppose somebody, a person passes away and leaves a property to somebody, and we use the blockchain to record that transfer. But then suppose 6 months later, a later will is found, and it turned out the person had another disposition of the property. So what happens today is you'd go through the court system, and that would be adjudicated there. But what would you do in this environment if a court rules, hey, person X shouldn't be the owner of this real estate, it's actually, charity Y. How would you then go back and change what's already in this immutable, in theory, blockchain? Right? There's no good answer to that, because if you allow the blockchain to be easily changed to accommodate that, you undermine one of the very things that makes it attractive in the first place. But if you don't allow it to be changed, then you undermine the ability to rectify things like the issues like that. Another challenge is hype, blockchain for everything. I mean, there's any problem you can think of, there's somebody out there claiming that the blockchain is going to be the solution to that problem, and it's really not the solution to all problems. It's not even the solution to most problems. It's only the solution to a very specific set of problems. And hype is damaging because when the promises that get made inevitably don't get realized, then that devalues the legitimate claims for areas where it actually can make a big difference. So hype is an obstacle as well. Regulation is a really complex issue. There's a bunch of state and government level entities are sort of trying to figure out how to regulate blockchain-based transactions, and our token, what is a security in the financial sense, and are people who are creating new cryptocurrencies and new tokens creating new securities, and so it's a complicated world in the regulatory environment as well. And the final one I'll talk about is consumer protection. I'll give an example of, there was a guy in England 5 or 6 years ago who was mining Bitcoin. And what that meant or means is that he had his computer and he was using his computer to basically create Bitcoin. And today, the number of computers in the network is so large that if I took my MacBook Air here and had it start mining Bitcoin, there's a very good chance that it could mine all of this year and I wouldn't get anything. But back when he was doing it, the network was smaller, and you were more likely, even with a relatively modest computer, to be able to actually kind of win the lottery every so often and actually accumulate Bitcoins. So he accumulated a fair number of Bitcoins, but then he decided to sell his computer. I guess he wasn't interested in having his computer anymore, and he broke it apart into parts and sold it. And turns out he took his hard drive and he threw it in the trash. But it turns out that what cryptographically, the private key, that essentially a very long alphanumeric password that he needed to get access to his Bitcoins was stored on the hard drive, which he'd thrown in the trash can. And so he couldn't get it. And so I saw an article at the end of last year, December 2017, man who threw away Bitcoin haul, now worth over 80 million, wants to dig up landfill site. So, I mean, you might too for $80 million, right? I mean, you think about, like, what happens when you throw something in the trash? Well, trash people come every week, and it goes to a landfill, and somewhere in this landfill is this hard drive, right, which is worth $80 million, or it was in December 2017. And so this person can see his Bitcoin digitally. You can look and see them, but he can't actually get them without access to the password, essentially, the key, more formally, that's on his drive. So he was, at least at this point, he was trying to find, I guess, investors, maybe, they'll give him bulldozers and all that kind of stuff, and if together they find this, maybe they get a third of the take or something like that. But the point is that there's the power of these decentralized networks, the advantage can also in some ways be their disadvantage, because it's not like if you forget your bank account number or you lose your credit card, you know where to go, right? You can call your bank or you can call a number, and it can be a little bit of a nuisance, but if you lose your bank account number, your bank's not going to say, well, you lost your bank account number, so money's gone. No, you'll get your money back. You might have to prove who you are and all that kind of stuff. But with this environment, because there's no 1-800 number you can call and say, I lost my Bitcoin. What are you going to do? So consumer protection is a real challenge in this kind of environment here. So let me show you some Bitcoin transactions as they're occurring here. So this is these are what you see here. These are. So I'll just show this one. Here's $316,000 just went by. These are real time. I'm not $288,000 right there. All sorts of amounts, everything from $7.89 up to $250,000 that we've just seen here, 73 cents. This is literally every single Bitcoin transaction that's occurring in the world in real time. It's interesting in that we have no idea who is sending this money to whom, right? So we just saw a few transactions of $250,000 roughly go by, and no idea where it is, right? If you want to go wire, $1,500 to somebody, in the UK to rent an apartment in London or something like that, that gets tracked very carefully through the Treasury and all that kind of stuff. But here we've got hundreds of thousands of dollars moving, who knows where, and there's no way to track it. Yeah. So these are the transactions that are being broadcast in the network. These are people. But the answer relates to this screen. So all these transactions are being sort of put out there, and the miners are basically trying to are competing with each other to package these transactions and put them inside the next block, to build the next block. So all the miners in the world are making a list of all these transactions, and they're racing to guess the right lottery number. And whoever guesses the right lottery number first gets the privilege of putting these transactions in the next block, and gets awarded 12.5 new Bitcoins for having done that. And then all the miners move on to the next one. Now, there was like $800,000 just went by. Great point. It's generated automatically by the network. No, there's no Bitcoin Central here. No, here's your 12.5. It's the network just automatically awards them. So yeah.
No one's in charge. Who awards the 12%?
12.5 Bitcoins. It's programmed automatically to be created once you prove to the network that you've won the lottery. Basically, it's all automatic, and you get given the next 12.5 Bitcoins. So. You win the lottery by basically guessing. All these people are competing to guess a certain number, and there's a cryptographic problem they're trying to solve. And by basically, it's something called a hash function. But basically, they're guessing a bunch of numbers, and each time they guess a number, they put it through a function called a hash function, and that sort of scrambles it in a random way, and you're trying to guess an input that creates a particular output. And so there's no deterministic way to do it. I'm sorry?
We don't get it at all.
Yeah, so you're just, if you think about that, suppose you have a black box, and every time you throw a number into that black box, it spits out a completely uncorrelated number, right? You throw in 26 and it spits out 122. But you throw in 22 and it spits out some other number. And you're trying to make it spit out 6, okay? But you have no idea what input's going to make it spit out 6. And so the only way to try to make it spit out 6 is to just try a whole bunch of inputs until you might get lucky and the output is 6, right? And all the miners in the world are all competing, and they're throwing random numbers into this thing, hoping that one of them throws in the right random number that results in the output, which is the number that solves the block. That's what mining is. But you can't predict it. You can't say, aha, if I want the output to be 6, I'm going to put in 7 because I know it's always going to subtract 1. You don't know that in advance. Yes? Yes, there's software that anybody who wants to be part of the Bitcoin network would download, which would take care of all this stuff. That's right. Is it legal? Is Bitcoin legal? No. Is the mining legal? I've never heard it suggested that it's criminal. I mean, it's there's certainly using cryptocurrencies to buy drugs would obviously not be legal, but I've in all the regulatory discussion I've never heard it suggested that it wasn't legal. Now, of course, you'd have legal obligations associated with that if every 10 minutes about somebody's going to get 12.5 new Bitcoins, which is, I don't know, some number of tens of thousands of dollars. But you would have tax obligations associated with that, right? But yeah.
So let's work on the basis that the network, the organization that is distributing the 12.5 network is actually relative to the government per se, in terms of how the creation of Bitcoin comes about.
When you say relative to the government,
Could we use the analogy of, government prints money, or the Fed, the Treasury prints money on behalf of the Fed, et cetera, et cetera.
right?
And they issue money, and money is created as a velocity of the economy, et cetera. But for the creation of Bitcoins, the network is actually not a single entity, but the collective hive of everybody in
Yes,
the network.
that's right.
That is, okay.
Yeah, and the network is collectively creating 12.5 new Bitcoins every 10 minutes. And it used to be 25 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. Before that, it was 50, and it's going to go down. And so the supply of Bitcoin is capped exponentially. It's going to approach a limit. And there's people who argue that that's a problem, right? Because you get a deflationary economy when you have a capped supply like that.
So to follow along, the question is the value of an actual coin, or it's basically a fiat currency, but of a digital transaction.
Well, I mean, technically speaking, a fiat currency is a currency, issued by a government, and so it's not. Right. So it's not. I mean, it's not formally. It's dollar is a fiat currency, and the yen and euro. So it's not in that sense.
So where's the full faith and credit, or the integrity or the trust coming from?
Well, that's a great question, and I'd flip it around and say it's like any other asset. Like why these values? Oh my gosh, someone just moved $3 million, right?
So it's basically we're getting back to the basics of what is the value of an ounce of gold.
Exactly, or a work of art, or a share of stock of a company, or.
Are we going back to the basics of almost barterism then?
I don't know if I would call it barterism, but the value of these. I mean, here's the exchange rate right now, $7,800. So the fact that one Bitcoin buys $7,800 is a consequence of willing buyers and willing sellers exchanging dollars for Bitcoin. It's just the market at work. Yes.
Could any one of us download a program, mine for Bitcoin, and would we all be just as good at it? It's just guessing random numbers?
Yeah, any one of you could become Bitcoin miners, but.
We're all just as good at it.
Well, it depends. It depends how much computing power you have. It's the question, if I go into a 7-Eleven and buy one lottery ticket, I'm much less likely to win than if I buy 1,000 lottery tickets. But it's going to cost me a lot more money to buy 1,000 lottery tickets. So if I have my little MacBook Air and I do mining, and you get a big giant rack of servers and you do Bitcoin mining, you're much more likely to solve these blocks than I am. So, yeah.
So when we talk about mining, the more successful miners, are they running server farms, or are they using a distributed process?
The more successful miners have entire buildings. No, 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 no. There are people, there are organizations that literally have entire buildings devoted to
Running a farm.
just running, consuming ungodly amounts of energy and mining and getting lots of Bitcoins. Yeah.
Am I mistaken to say that, of course, people don't want to do the math, but these people are doing the math, and the calculation is the next large prime number?
It's not really the next large prime number. It's a different mathematical problem. Instead, what they're trying to do is solve a hash problem. But yeah. And the other, let me go back to the energy efficiency. Like I said, you're looking at every single transaction. The transaction rate is somewhere between 3 and 7 transactions per second. And yet, to do that, we're using more energy than all of Ireland, right? So if you think about the energy cost per transaction, it's horrible. It's really, really bad. By contrast, if you can imagine how many transactions per second Visa or MasterCard are processing, right? The number is, I don't know the exact number, but it's many, many, many thousands of transactions per second. So in that sense, this is a very, very inefficient network. Yes?
So this is Bitcoin.
This is Bitcoin.
What about the other cryptocurrencies? What about something like Ethereum?
Yeah, well, okay, so Ethereum you mentioned, so it's actually, that cryptocurrency is called Ether. Ethereum is the framework that uses it. Yeah, you could construct a similar picture showing Ether going back and forth.
And so it's using the same process?
It's using the same process, although less total energy because it's a smaller network. But it's using, both of these use something called proof of work, which is this guessing game we talked about. Although Ethereum is talking about moving, because specifically of this energy problem, Ethereum is talking about shifting to a completely different system for doing this mining, which would not use a lot of this energy. It's called proof of stake, but they haven't actually done it yet. Yes?
I've heard that blockchain can be used for climate change issues. Yet it would seem if you're using this.
You mean to make it worse? I haven't heard about a climate change application to blockchain. I mean, you know, I don't know. I mean, certainly it's not a good thing from an energy standpoint, at least this particular thing. You had a question?
I always thought that mining Bitcoin, for instance, was creating Bitcoin, but it sounds more like it's searching.
Well, it is. You're trying to guess these numbers, and if you guess it right, then you get the right to package all these transactions that have occurred since the last person won, and you put them in a block, and then you're rewarded with 12.5 new Bitcoins. That's the incentive. Yes, sir.
If you're trying to guess these numbers, who makes up the numbers?
The system automatically sort of self-calibrates, and every time there's a new block, the system sort of sets a new target, and everyone tries to guess that. Yeah, I'm sorry. It's actually, it's not completely random. It's the ability to guess it requires randomness, but there's a deterministic process to make sure the difficulty is always about right. The network self-calibrates so that on average it takes 10 minutes before somebody gets the block. And so if 100 times more people pile into the system, obviously there's a lot more computing power, then the problem will become 100 times harder, so that on average it still takes about 10 minutes before somebody figures it out. Because otherwise, as more computers piled in, the time to solve each block would get really, really short.
So the correct sequence of numbers takes approximately 10 minutes in the system.
Well, it takes, with all the people in the world collectively guessing, it takes about 10 minutes before one of those people guesses a number that produces, technically speaking, a hash that's below a certain threshold. Yes?
I'm a million weeds. I want to know if I'm able to download this software for free, and people are out there putting all that information in, and they get 12.5 Bitcoins for the big prize. What's the prize? Where is there dollars behind it?
Well, the 12.5 Bitcoins, if you get, each Bitcoin is $8,000. So if I get 12.5 Bitcoins, I can go to an exchange and convert it to whatever 12.5 times, like $80,000.
Walk away with
Cash, dollars, yeah. Because there's exchanges. But right now, that's the exchange rate. There's exchanges all over the place where you can take Bitcoin, and you give them Bitcoin, and they give you dollars. Or you give them dollars, they give you Bitcoin. I said this, and then you, and then back, yeah.
I was just going to say, this must be very profitable if you're talking.
I'm sorry? Yeah, go ahead.
This must be extremely profitable if you're talking about whole buildings that are doing this. Is there any measurement of
You know,
doing it and what they're earning from it?
you could figure out what they're earning because there's no secrets. Everybody knows sort of which, where the, which nodes are getting the Bitcoins. Whether it's profitable, yeah, if you have a whole building, you'll win a lot. But on the other hand, you had to buy all the computers to fill the building, and you got to pay for all the electricity to do that. So it's like oil, right? You think about it, like as the oil prices go up and down, people make very different decisions about what kind of trouble they're going to go through to extract oil. And so if this number is 7,800, people will do things that they won't do if it goes down to 5,000. And today they're not doing things, last year, at the end of last year, was up near 18 or 20,000. So those swings can really affect things. Somebody in the back had a question here.
Yeah, so you get 12.5 Bitcoin every time you solve this or log into this. But I understand there's a finite number of Bitcoin, so does this end at some point, or what happens?
Well, it's, again, every 10 minutes, about, on average, you get the winner, the person who solved that block gets 12.5 Bitcoins, and every year and a half or two, that number halves. So in a year or so, it'll be 6.25 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. And the rewards are going down exponentially. That's right. And so there's a capped, essentially a capped money supply. And that's one of the criticisms of Bitcoin, which is that the money supply is capped, right? And, again, economists will tell you that it's important to be able to put your hands on the, and by the way, I'm not here as like an ardent defender saying that Bitcoin is perfect. I'm just answering the question. So there's economists who will tell you that it's important to be able to have your hands on the dials on the money supply, right? And to issue, and that possibility does not exist with Bitcoin. And that's one of the things, the issues that some other cryptocurrencies have specifically been designed to address. Right? If I'm going to start a cryptocurrency today, I might say, well, hey, I don't want to have a capped supply. I want some flexibility to have the network collectively decide on the supply or something like that. But in Bitcoin, it's hardwired. Yes. Yeah.
Can you give another example of like Ripple or another coin, another currency that has a similar system or a different system, and actually can you use this to actually pay for services or goods? Like, oh, I want to pay for my Airbnb in London.
Yeah, it's very difficult. There's a few, to use this in daily life, it's pretty difficult. There's a few places where you could actually go and, buy coffee with Bitcoin, but it hasn't really caught on, in that, and the 10-minute thing, it takes 10 minutes to build a block, and then the block that just got constructed may not stay there. It may actually get revised, and so it's really only 5 or 6 or 7 blocks into the past when you can actually be really confident that a transaction is going to stick. So that's an hour. And now I've heard, I don't know if it's still true, but I've heard you can buy a Tesla with Bitcoin. Now, if you're buying a car, then you probably wouldn't mind waiting an hour for the transaction to settle. But if you're buying a donut, you're certainly not going to wait, an hour. You can say, well, here's the card. You got to wait an hour before you get your donut. That wouldn't be very useful. So, yeah.
It seemed to me that the block, when you add information to a block, it's recording a transaction.
Yes.
But I'm confused about, you get 12 Bitcoin if you get the right to do the block, but what information is being recorded in the block?
All these transactions you're seeing right here.
Yeah, you have to explain that the people who are mining the Bitcoins, they're providing the infrastructure for this thing, and they're earning these Bitcoins as a sort of a payment. But what are those transactions?
Yeah,
The, yeah, so yeah, there's two, I should explain. There's two different, there's the people who are mining, who are running the network, right? And then there's the people who are transacting, right? So you don't have to own a bank or be a bank to use a bank, right? So the same thing is true with Bitcoin, right? I could not be doing any mining, but I could buy Bitcoin. I could go to an exchange and give them $8,000 or $7,907, and they would give me 1 Bitcoin. And then once I had my Bitcoin, I could go send pieces of it to wherever I wanted the network, and it would end up being one of these transactions right here. Okay? So there's a set of people who are administering the network by mining, right? And there's a much larger set of people who are transacting. Just like there's a set of banks that are administering banking, and then there's a much larger people who are using banks. But you don't have to be a bank to use one. Yeah. Right, I wouldn't say it's on top of it, but yes, as another independent aspect of the system is there's an exchange rate. That's right, yeah.
I'm really interested in smart contracts and some of the other examples, blockchain. Can we move on to
I'm just trying to answer the questions here. All right. So, all right, so let me, in the interest of time, let me move on to smart contracts here. Okay, so let me just say a couple of things. Here's the market cap as of today. All the Bitcoins in the world are worth $136 billion. Then Ether, 47 billion, Ripple, 18 billion, Bitcoin Cash. So the point, the specific numbers don't really matter, but the fact is there's a lot of value here. I mean, it's nothing value-wise compared with the value of dollars, all the dollars, or euros, or Chinese yuan, or yen, or whatever. But it's still a lot relative to what people might have thought was possible. So I've got a bunch of stuff about, here's an example Bitcoin transaction, but let me skip that because I want to get to smart contracts here. Let me just show this one thing. This is the Bitcoin, this is a pie chart showing the power of the miners in Bitcoin. And one of the most interesting things is, remember I said before that if more than 50% of the power is held by one entity, the network gets compromised, right? And there's 10,000 or so Bitcoin mining nodes out there. But these three together collectively control more than 50%, right? Now, I'm aware of no evidence that these three parties are actually working together, right? But the point I wanted to show here is that it's not as far-flung a possibility as somebody might suggest that it is possible. These are the folks that have the entire buildings. I mean, they're literally whole buildings doing this stuff. And so it's not as distributed as some people will sometimes suggest. Okay, so let me move on to smart contracts. Smart contracts are super interesting. So first of all, to start this off, quick answer, what's a contract? Just a regular contract. How would you define it? What is it? It's an agreement between two parties, that's right. And so a smart contract is an agreement also. It's just expressed in code. So a traditional contract defines the obligations of the parties. A smart contract, it resides in the blockchain. So we're moving on beyond Bitcoin. This is not Bitcoin, this is something else. But like Bitcoin, smart contracts are distributed and processed collectively with a large network of computers. They're self-executing. These contracts are, and I'm going to give examples in just a minute of how that might work. And they take steps according to particular criteria. And again, I'm going to give you examples so that'll help. Smart contracts are useful because they can reduce or eliminate the need for an intermediary. One of the things that's costly in a lot of contractual transactions is the presence of intermediaries who need money to participate in the system. And although, as I'll mention, an oracle, a source of truth can be useful. I'll talk about that in a moment. And the smart contract can minimize a risk that one party doesn't fulfill its obligations. So let's talk about some of the things a smart contract could do. I should also say Ethereum if you've heard of it, and it came up a few moments ago, is a framework specifically designed to allow deployment of smart contracts. And so Ethereum is the network, not Bitcoin. Ethereum is the network that people use for smart contracts. So one kind of smart contract, which no one would ever want to do because it adds no value, but I just want to give an illustration, is a contract that simply adds two numbers and gives the result, right? You give it 4 and 3 and it tells you that a sum is 7. Now there's absolutely no reason to have a smart contract deployed on a blockchain to do that, but I mention that simply because it's an example of a very simple operation that you could execute in a distributed manner with a program that's deployed on the blockchain. So let's move to some more practical examples. Another example of a smart contract could be a contract that initiates a royalty payment each time a song is played on a particular network. So what you could have, the way it works right now, it's often very inefficient. Royalty payments are calculated by, there's organizations that monitor what gets streamed, and then there's a whole back offices of accountants and all kinds of stuff. A lot of that stuff could be automated, and every time a particular digital song is streamed, then it could initiate automatically a royalty payment and divide it up among the interest holders in that royalty. Another example would be to come up with contracts to evaluate compound conditions. Now here's an example. Suppose we want to know if the following condition is going to be true or not. At no time in the next 30 calendar days will the price per share on NASDAQ of the company X fall below Y dollars per share. And in this case, the code's going to evaluate the price per share every day or every trading day over the next 30 days. And either this condition will be satisfied or it will be not. And once it is possible to know whether that's true or not, then a payment will automatically be made. Now you might say, why do you need a smart contract to do this? Because there's futures markets and derivatives markets and all sorts of markets out there already. And it's true, but the challenge is that the markets that are out there right now only exist for certain widely traded products. So if you want to buy an option related to the price of IBM 30 days or 60 days or something from now, you can do that because there's a lot of people that are interested in taking both sides of that bet. But if you want to have a more esoteric product where there might only be 15 people in the world who want to take the other side of that bet, smart contracts give you an opportunity to buy that product without having any traditional financial entity having decided that the market is big enough to offer it. So it greatly expands the potential set of offerings in the financial market. So here's an example of a compound condition that you might not find an offering in the sort of standard financial sector market products there. During the next 30 days, is this condition going to be met? The price per share of company X will not fall below Y dollars per share, and the price per share of company W will not exceed Z dollars. Now, depending on the variables X, Y, W, and Z, there's a very good chance there is not a standard product out there that allows you to make that bet. Yet with smart contracts, you and the counterparty on the other side can decide to enter into that contract, and then the contract itself will allow both of you to engage and participate in a market that otherwise wouldn't have a product to support it. Another example is a derivative-based example. So for example, you could have a smart contract to say that if between April and June the market price of steel goes above X, then the buyer has the option but not the obligation to purchase up to R units of wood at rate Y from wood supplier Z. Right, again, we're getting into very specific sets of combinations and derivatives that in a traditional environment, sure, you could have gone out and paid someone a bunch of money to sort of construct a contractual arrangement without the blockchain to enter into an agreement like this. But with smart contracts, you can do so far more quickly, far more efficiently, and without the need for any sort of intermediary to sort of bless or set this thing up. And then once the smart contract is agreed on, because it's like if all of you, I'm sure, have had the experience of negotiating a contract where you're being asked to sign something, and what you would typically do is you look at the contract very carefully, and there might be some clauses you don't understand or you want to change, and the other party does the same thing, and you don't sign it until you and the other party have both sort of understood that you agree to everything that's in the contract. In a smart contract world, you do the same thing, but you do it with the code that expresses the things like this. And once you have agreed on the code, that the code is the right code, then you both press the button and the code just does it. And you can't go back later and say, well, I didn't mean rate Y, I meant rate Y plus 15%. You can't do that because the code will automatically be taking care of executing it in accordance with the conditions that you agreed up front are part of that contract. So there's a whole world, and this is, by the way, most of these examples are from the financial sector except for the royalty payment one, but there's a whole world of really interesting kind of product offerings that you can imagine that you can create with these smart contracts. Let me briefly, have you ever heard of initial coin offerings, ICOs? Let me briefly mention those just because there are a lot of, there's been a lot of press about those. ICOs are what a lot of companies in this space basically are, instead of raising money through venture capital, they're just issuing tokens, which are sort of blockchain-based entities, and they're selling them, and they're raising just really insane amounts, just enormous amounts of money. And it raises all sorts of complicated regulatory issues about whether these are securities or not. This is either a very good thing if you're a company that's trying to raise lots of money and don't want to go through the venture capital route, or a very risky thing. I personally think that a lot of people who have paid a lot of money to buy into these ICOs are not going to get their money back because, these, yeah.
So I know you made this presentation in the Senate. Was this one of the things that they asked you about in terms of?
Well, it was on Capitol Hill, but it wasn't to the whole Senate. This was.
Were they looking at the registry and monitoring, tracking them?
I don't know. I mean, because I gave a general presentation, and I don't know what the people in the room might.
As interactive as this?
It was pretty interactive. Yeah, but I don't know this. It was more me talking to them and answering their questions, but I don't know whether they were not really interested at all or whether they were furiously drafting regulations. So I have no idea. No idea. I'm sorry? There's some. I was presenting actually mostly to staffers, and I found that in my experience, staffers of both parties are extremely good. I mean, they're really. I've been super impressed in my dealings with them. So it's 7:26. I'll just really quickly. One of the super interesting questions when people are issuing these ICOs are token securities, and there's this fascinating kind of legal question about what is a security, and believe it or not, the answer to that question goes back to the Securities Act of 1933, and there's a whole legal test called the Howey, H-O-W-E-Y, if you want to look it up, Howey test about whether it's a security. So there's a lot of lawyers being kept very busy these days trying to decide whether people who are issuing these tokens on the blockchain to raise money are in fact issuing securities, which places them in there's a whole set of requirements. If you're going to sell securities, you're subject to a whole bunch of registration and other requirements, generally, with some exceptions, than if you're not. So that's a very, very active area of regulation. And I should also say that in the United States, obviously we're only one country, but for all the complexity we have here in the U.S., there's a very active regulatory effort ongoing in many countries, not just the United States. So just three slides of conclusion here. This technology has, I think, high impact potential in a whole range of sectors, which I won't bore you with reading right here. But I think it's important to maintain focus on applications where the blockchain technology can really add value. There's a lot of times where people sort of get, I think, a little sidetracked and say, hey, we should, do blockchain for XYZ, and I'm thinking, well, XYZ is actually just fine without the blockchain. It's not going to really help us. So it's important to look carefully at the specific, whether there's a problem that's going to be solved, and if so, that problem can be, yeah, question?
John, would you just indicate to us of this list, which do you think has the most potential? And also, when we're asking questions, we're going to send around a microphone so we can capture your questions for our other audiences as well, and also so everyone can hear.
Yeah, it's hard to pick a complete favorite. I would say that the obvious applications are in finance. I can tell you a whole bunch of those right now. Digital rights management is another really good area. There's some really good possible medical applications as well for medical records and things like that. Insurance is another area, but it's hard to sort of say one is much better than the other. Voting is another one. There's a lot of people who are looking at voting using blockchain, not just to do votes the way we typically do votes, but to do much more sophisticated things with voting. So, for example, enabling voting where instead of picking one candidate or another candidate, actually in San Francisco we had this ranked voting thing, right? But you can even get more sophisticated. Suppose you had 100 points to allocate, and you could allocate them however you wanted among however many candidates you wanted, right? So there's lots of interesting things that you could think of in the voting. So anyway, second slide here of 3. It's not the solution to all problems. Too much hype here. And there's also too much information, too much misinformation. I often hear things like, statements like the blockchain is immutable, but whether that's actually true or not depends on the specifics of which blockchain. There's not just one blockchain. I've created blockchains on my computer, and then I stopped them. I just said, okay, no more. Well, yeah.
Can you wait for the microphone, please? Coming your way.
You've been talking about sort of the pure version, Satoshi Nakamoto, if he even existed. But what about the proprietary versions that we're seeing from Goldman Sachs and the other investment banking companies? Does what you're talking about here apply to those?
Well, okay, so are you talking about public versus private blockchains? Is that what you're...
There's private blockchains.
Yeah, there's private blockchains. I mean, so public blockchain is the one we're talking about where anybody can join and anybody can put their computer and have it be part of the network. A private blockchain would be one, for example, run by an entity. To me, that's less interesting because if one or a small number of entities are going to be gatekeepers, then you could argue that maybe makes it a little bit harder to gain the very advantages that this technology offers, which is this fact of distributed, fully distributed things. So in the extreme case, if one company all by itself was going to run a blockchain, then you might argue, why is that really much different than if that same company just maintained a database, right? because if they have access, if they control everything about it, then is that really different than just a database? So anyway, just finally closing up here. Like I said, there's going to be a movement. There has to be away from this mining because of just the terrible energy inefficiency that we have there. There's going to be some regulatory actions specifically related to initial coin offerings and to a lot of aspects of this space. This space is really sort of challenging a lot of very traditional regulatory frameworks that really were never developed with this kind of distributed processing in mind. Everything from money transfer, which is very kind of jurisdiction oriented, and it makes a big difference whether you're transferring money from here within the United States versus from here outside the United States. But with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. So consumer protection frameworks obviously are going to need attention. And I think that a lot of the applications in the future are going to have some hybrid mix involving sort of decentralized processing with some of the advantages there, but also some of the more centralized processing advantages that you get when you have things like, when you have problems or challenges like consumer protection that you need to address. So anyway, 7:32, I'm 2 minutes over, but I know actually we start at 6:33, so. So yeah, anyway, so happy to take questions, but I also won't be at all, the event was supposed to go to 7:30, so I won't be at all offended if any of you just get up and leave. But thank you very much for your time. So.
We have a question back here.
I'm sorry, is somebody asking a question?
So we're talking about distributed computing for all this, where we're validating transactions over a network, but what about hosting your own transactions? I mean, that's a form of decentralization as well. And is that another form of the blockchain? Where
I mean, if I hosted my own transactions on my computer here?
And it shuts down with you? And
yeah, I could, but then I guess what I'd come back with is sort of why. What would it allow me to do that I couldn't?
Well, participate in the network, I suppose, but like just in the same way. I mean, because the sort of the position I'm curious about is that if you're centering around these blockchains around an application, doesn't that make it a centralized network for a purpose?
Well, it's I mean, you could argue the Bitcoin is centralized in the sense that it's meant for exchanging currency, but it's not. When I think of centralized, I'm talking about the actual topology of the network, and in that sense, it's very distributed. It's single topic. It's focused, right? If I want to use Bitcoin for...
But people still have to sync the blockchain.
Sorry?
People still have to sync the blockchain. You can't do that on your MacBook Pro.
You can't do what?
You can't sync the blockchain.
I could certainly download the Bitcoin blockchain on my MacBook. I could download the whole thing. The whole thing is all the transactions that have ever occurred in Bitcoin are some number of, it's less than a terabyte, way under a terabyte. So I could, it's a couple hundred gigabytes. Yeah, how much? 250 gigabytes, right? So I could easily put it on something like that.
We're going to go back here. Question?
Yeah, hi. Is Ethereum also based on, Ethereum approved, I guess would be the term for it, by cryptography?
Yeah, it's based, it's cryptographic. They're all going to be, every one of these systems is going to be cryptographically based. When I say cryptographic, I'm talking about using things called digital signatures and so on. But yes, they're all going to be cryptographically secured, just simply to protect that, that my digital wallet or my digital assets can only be transferred to someone else if I've given the authorization. So Ethereum, like all of these others, uses cryptographic techniques to do that.
So with that being built into it then, I'm wondering what will happen if, some radically new...
like quantum computing or something?
Yeah, that can, do code breaking that isn't now built into Ethereum. Would they have to build a new cryptographic method into Ethereum? And what would that entail?
If quantum computing becomes a reality, then most of our digital infrastructure for security and cryptography is going to need to be redone. I mean, it's a huge. It would be an absolutely enormous thing, and even things like how you buy stuff online, through Amazon, credit card transactions, all these codes, all these cryptographic methods that work because they are essentially unbreakable, would no longer be unbreakable, and that would also be true for these applications. So yeah, it would be. But then presumably some people would come up with new ways to secure things, and it wouldn't be the end of things. It would just be a new phase. It's a great question.
And would that mean a new kind of Ethereum with a new cryptographic method, or could they put that into the Ethereum coin
You could, in Bitcoin and Ethereum, there's ways to sort of collectively update the software that people are using. So I would presume that the community would react by doing that.
Question here?
Yeah.
We'll pop over here.
Yeah, so everyone is talking about blockchain and Bitcoin, which is like secure. But what about if like Google or Apple or like they just start mining with this guy, and then they will have more
Sorry,
than
if Google or Apple what?
Google or Apple start mining as well, and then they will have for sure more than 51% of like computational resources, and then they're gonna cheat easily the network. But then, in my opinion, they're just leaving the system because it's useful for like drugs and weapon dealers. This is my opinion. What do you think about that? Used for drugs and weapons dealers.
Drugs and
Weapons dealers.
the system?
The Bitcoin or like Ethereum or everything, we just saw like 3 million transactions, $3 million transaction. What is that? For sure, it's not donut or like McDonald's.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's, a couple of things. So first of all, is Bitcoin sometimes used for illegal things? Yes, but is cash sometimes used for, again, it's the, you can have a discussion about that. And could Google take all of their servers and start mining Bitcoin? I guess in theory they could. I've seen no indication that they might, but any system like that is always, in theory, vulnerable to some giant actor coming in and using a bunch of computing power. But that hasn't been, people worry about a lot of things. I haven't seen a lot of worry about that, but it's not impossible. What I don't know, though, is the collective power of Google's computers, how that compares with these big giant mining. It may in fact not be as much as these. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, unless Google was going to stop doing search, but they're not going to do that, right?
Question here.
Does anybody make it their business to watch which new applications are coming online so we can kind of, out of curiosity, see what this stuff is really good for?
There's a ton of people, absolutely. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem of people trying to start startup companies, and there's conferences you can go to where there's days and days of sessions, people talking about their applications. Is there one publication? No, I mean, it's kind of the decentralized ethos of the whole community. Is there's not like one clearinghouse where they all sort of say, hey, I've got a new app, and I'm going to go tell you and say, no, there's no, but people who want to know, it's not generally secret. You could go and figure out what's out there. But it's changing every day. Like this week, there's new stuff that wasn't out there last week because it's a super active, thriving ecosystem. And, like any of these startup-heavy ecosystems, there's also stuff that was out there last week that isn't out there this week because it didn't work, right? That happens too. Yes?
Yeah, so earlier you were talking about how companies don't really use Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies for transactions. Let's say you're buying clothes, they wouldn't use Bitcoin for buying clothes. I'm curious if companies were to use cryptocurrencies for that.
You mean to accept cryptocurrencies?
If they were to accept cryptocurrency as a medium of exchange, would that make it so that the blockchain has to be verified faster? And if so, how would that affect the giving out of new Bitcoin?
Well, so it's a good question, but it's mixing a couple different things. Like the Bitcoin blockchain only makes blocks on average every 10 minutes or so. But for example, the Ethereum blockchain, the time between each block is only 10 or 15 seconds. And in fact, one of the design philosophy approaches behind Ethereum was exactly to solve the 10-minute problem that is a problem for Bitcoin. So Ethereum is far more amenable in the time delay sense to something like that. But I think the biggest impediment to adoption for companies is not the time to processing, because that could be solved with any, there's something called the Lightning Network, which is being built on top of Bitcoin to make it much faster. There's a bunch of solutions out there. But there's the issue of sort of why, right? What problem is it solving that, companies already can't, what would companies be able to do if they accepted payment in Bitcoin that they can't already do today with cash and credit cards? And there's not a lot of, it's not that compelling. So that's why I think a lot of people haven't adopted it right now.
So it's a matter of convenience.
It's a matter of convenience and also inertia. I mean, I should also say, but having studied this, you realize some things don't make sense in our current system. For example, credit cards. Like the whole idea, I mean, credit cards in general have some logic, but the whole idea that to pay for something with a credit card, you have to give them all the numbers needed to defraud you, right? That's just a strange idea. Like if credit cards didn't exist and I proposed that, people would be like, well, that's idiotic. It doesn't make any sense. Like why would you construct a system where you give you all the information so that if I'm unethical, I can just go steal money from you? It doesn't make any sense, right? And so it makes, in that sense, the cryptocurrencies are a lot more logical because what they do is they use cryptographic methods to allow people to prove that they really have the authority to spend the money without giving the recipient of the transaction information that they could then use to spend more money, right? So you don't have the equivalent of the unethical merchant or the man in the middle attack where you can hack into these, even if someone is able to intercept every single bit that I send in when initiating a cryptocurrency transaction, that would still not give them any ability to spend more of my money. And that's not true with credit cards. Yeah.
A question with regard to your first statement on the slide there with the blockchains moving away from mining and towards proof of stake. What does that look like, proof of stake?
Proof of stake is an approach. So Ethereum, the Ethereum network is talking about moving to something called Casper, C-A-S-P-A-R. Proof of stake is basically something where instead of guessing lots of numbers, what confers on you the ability to create new blocks is the fact that you have a stake, an ownership stake already in the network. And there's lots of different variants, but one variant is, for example, giving random people in the network, randomly choosing them and allowing them to be the validator for the next block of transactions. That's one example. There's a whole bunch of techniques, and it all traces back, if you're interested, there's a paper on something called Byzantine fault tolerance that was written back in the 1980s that way before any of this stuff, that lays the groundwork for how you can arrive in consensus on networks. But that's an approach that doesn't require all this crazy guessing. And so but it's got its own disadvantages, otherwise everyone would have already moved to it. So the challenge is how to work out those disadvantages, get those advantages without suffering from some of the disadvantages. Another question here.
One more question? Anyone else that hasn't? Let's go here and we'll come back to you.
This is a question about blockchain, but not a currency. You said that supply chain is one of the uses.
Right.
I understand that, for instance, food supplies can be traced back to the source. If a certain farm in Iowa is, if the cattle there have gone to a store in a Safeway store in California, that store knows can find out where that cow came from if there's a problem with the meat product.
Right.
Is that done on blockchain?
It is not, as far as I'm aware, it is not currently done on blockchain. That there's other infrastructure for doing that, but that's an example of a system, that's something that could be tracked on the blockchain. And you might say, well, why? And the answer is, well, if you, for any reason, didn't trust or didn't want to rely on a single entity to do that tracking, then blockchain could give you a mechanism to do that.
Okay, 2 questions will be a wrap.
I feel like maybe I just had an aha moment, but maybe I'm wrong. The reason for Bitcoin mining is to get other people to do the work of creating the blockchain. Like basically, if you need this big computing power infrastructure to create and legitimize the blocks, is that why?
Yeah, you have to give an incentive.
Otherwise, otherwise someone who started Bitcoins would have to have their own giant.
Yeah, you have to provide an incentive for these people all over the world to devote their computers to running the network.
Right.
And so the mining ecosystem is the way that they get paid to do that.
Got it. But it's kind of specific. It's interestingly specific to blockchain or Bitcoin because Goldman Sachs or like Wells Fargo doesn't have to farm out people legitimizing their transactions. They just do it in-house, right?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by their transactions, but I mean, those are 2 completely different things. Goldman is obviously a very well-reputed company, but it's not a distributed entity the way that the Bitcoin network is. So it's a completely different thing.
What kinds of tangible effects, pressures, changes is blockchain having on existing systems that are most striking to you?
You know, I think it depends on the on the context. So, for example, I think it's making people take a really hard look at digital rights management ecosystem solutions and identify inefficiencies there and make them do that more efficiently. I think it's spurring a kind of a revolution in how we think about distributed processing in general and the ability to sort of collectively use thousands of different computers to do tasks. I think it's creating a bunch of new opportunities in industries like the insurance industry. But it still hasn't, changed the world, right, in any, major way, the way the internet has. But the other, when I say that, I should, and I don't think it's as impactful as the internet writ large, but I should also say that the internet was invented in 1969, I think, and most of us didn't even hear of it until 1995, and in 1995, nobody could imagine social networks. And so it took decades for that technology to have an effect. And so I think the technology for distributed trust was essentially invented, well, the Bitcoin stuff was released in 2008 or 2009. It's still very early days right now, so it's hard to know really where it's going to go in the future. So I guess that's it. So thanks to all of you for your time.
Thanks to John Villasenor. Thank you, audience. Come